Our scripture today is from Luke chapter 11, verses 37 to 54. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and reclined at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." One of the lawyers answered him, "Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also." And he said, "Woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering." As he went away from there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
What's the biggest threat to the church today? Is it the rise of what are called the nones, people who don't have any religious affiliation, or the ways in which alternative religions become so much more normal? Is it our worship of a radical autonomy, that each of us a law unto ourselves, and the way we see that work itself out in so many different fronts, in the sexual revolution, in a sense of everybody gets to be in charge of their own life when it ends? Or is it the socioeconomic conditions and structures that create disparity and injustice and atomize, so that the very social conditions that we consider normal push us away from each other and from connection? Or is the biggest threat to the church polarization, the distrust that we have of each other, and the ways in which the Christian faith is taken captive and made to serve political ideologies either on the left or on the right? Or is the biggest threat perhaps, as Jesus names it here, theologically informed, biblically literate, morally conservative people whose hearts are far from God? The way in which Jesus talks in this passage seems to say that the biggest threat to the church is not the obvious external threats. It is the threat that looks good on the outside, that seems to be committed to all the things that it looks like we should care about, but actually is hollowed out and doesn't actually engage from the heart. It looks pious, it looks faithful, but it's actually far from God. Jesus seems to name that the threat that we need to actually look out for is this tendency in each of our hearts that he names in the Pharisees and the lawyer theologians of the day. And I don't think in some ways that we're in the exact same place as the people that Jesus is speaking to. I don't think we're committed wholesale to their way of approaching the Bible in faith, but I do think the seeds of that approach are in us. Maybe even the shoots starting to grow up in our lives and in our hearts. And so I think Jesus' words to them are words to us this morning as well, to say, be aware. And take seriously, look at the garden and weed and watch it so that you're directing your hearts and the whole of the rest of our lives toward God. So how does it all kick off? Well, my Nana, my grandmother, was one of her mantras. Anytime we would come to the table, she would ask, "Have you scrubbed?" And if my Nana asked Jesus, "Have you scrubbed?" Jesus would have said, "Nope." And what is going on? Why is Jesus just uncaring about hygienic cleanliness? I think Jesus is actually provoking an issue here. I think Jesus is not washing his hands. It is not just, well, I forgot or I didn't care, but actually it's designed to create a confrontation. To create a confrontation specifically with the Pharisees. Now, to understand what's happening, we need a bit of a word about the Pharisees, because for us, Pharisee is a bad word. It is a bogeyman to put out there. But in their day, the Pharisees weren't seen that way at all. The Pharisees were largely a lay movement. So they weren't necessarily the priests or the religious teachers of the day, though in this case there's some overlap, but they were a lay movement that was committed to the reform and the renewal of God's people. Their heart was for a serious faith, a whole engagement with what they thought God was calling them to. And they saw it specifically in the context of the law that God had given to the people of Israel. That what made them a nation as Israel was the covenant that God gave to Moses of the Torah, of the law. And they felt like that was the center defining characteristic for them as a people. And the way in which to relate to God and to be serious about relationship with God was through adherence to a faithful obedience, a serious, whole life encompassing obedience to God's law. And so to do that, to make sure that they were really engaging with God's law, they developed this sense of you have to protect God's law by putting a boundary around it. Think of it this way, as when an army is out in the field and they are moving through a country and they stop and they make their camp, they put a perimeter around that camp for looking out for the enemy. Because you don't want the enemy to get right at your camp. You want to be able to meet them further out and to be aware. And so in that same way, the Pharisees thought, to protect God's law, you don't want to come right up against it, so you want to create a perimeter around it. And if you obey that perimeter, then you know that you're obeying and protecting God's law. And so the hand washing here is a good example of that. So in the Old Testament, it was said that if you touched a bodily discharge, if you had a bodily discharge or you came into contact, that made you unclean. Not necessarily hygienically unclean, but this sense of purity as expressed in ritual, as supposed to be an exemplar of our hearts. And so the idea was, you want to avoid contact with a bodily discharge. You don't know, well, what might happen, where might that be, and so you wash your hands. And there's all sorts of ceremonial washings that they would have at different points, but particularly here before eating, because you wanted to be careful. And what started out, you could say, as good advice, hey, that's not a bad idea, becomes far more set and rigid and the equivalent of a law itself. And Jesus here breaks it and astonishes the host. The host is just totally taken aback, surprised, and Jesus then escalates it by verbally confronting him. And I couldn't help but think about this week and the Thanksgiving table. And so many of us have some level of anxiety or nervousness about sitting down at the Thanksgiving table, and like, when and where is it going to get awkward or tense? When is the conversation going to go the place that you don't really want it to go? And maybe you're just hoping, can we at least make it to dessert? Like, I don't think I'm going to make it all the way through, but at least can we make it to the end? But Jesus gets there before the very first dish is served, and he confronts them about what he's done and why he has done it. And the question is, well, why? Because as you think about the Pharisees and you think about their commitment to renewal, their commitment to being serious about their faith, you would think these are the kind of people that Jesus would make common cause with. These seem like the kind of people that Jesus would get on board with, and that they, and likewise, would get on board with Jesus. So why is there this disconnect? The problem is that they have taken the law and made it central, rather than seeing the law as pointing to how you are to relate to God and the relationship that God was promising. Paul will talk about this later. Paul will say the law is not the center. The promise was what defines, the promise that looks to a Messiah. But they had taken the law and they had made this the fulcrum, with this sense of, if we keep this, then we're okay with God. And when we name it that way, we realize, oh, that encompasses us as well. The prophets had diagnosed this all along. They had said, if you base your relationship with God on the law, you will break that relationship. Because you're going to break the law, you can't keep the law. And if you find a way somehow to keep the law, it's because you've distorted it and thereby broken it as well. And so this is about the heart level questions. It's about how we try to find a way to make ourselves okay. Finding something that we can do or not do that makes us acceptable, that I feel like, oh, I have standing because I can say I have done this. That is the Pharisee heart, or the Pharisee tendency that they're embodying, but I think is in us as well. And so the passage, I think, this morning for us is a way to examine and to say, where are the possibilities? Where are the ways that I am Phariseeing it up? Where are the places in which I am tending toward finding something that I can make the way in which I'm like, oh, now I'm okay. I've done this. I haven't done that, so I'm acceptable. I can stand before God. So there's a couple of tendencies that I'm going to examine. There's a lot more here that we could look at. I'm just going to dip in and take a couple of them as exemplars. And I want to make this note. Carrie Newhoff, a pastor, said this in talking about the Pharisees, and I thought it was really good. When we're talking through these points, don't think as much about, oh, that point, I know who that points to. but think more about, hey, where is this exposing in my life, in my heart, my attitude, and my actions? Because if we hear this and we think, oh, I'm really glad so-and-so really should hear this, then we're actually in the exact place where we need to be the ones who hear it. All right? So first, how do we Pharisee it up? We Pharisee it up, Jesus says, when we focus on the outside at the expense of the inside. Look what he says in verse 39. Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. Jesus is naming with a really vivid image how we can focus on the external and not pay attention to the internal. So Aaron and I, when we moved into our house 8 years ago, we did some different renovations, but we kept the dishwasher because it still had life in it, and we nursed that dishwasher along for the last 7+ years until finally the incidences became too often. You'd open it up and you would find a bowl or a cup that looked fine on the outside, and then you would look and you'd be like, no water or dishwashing detergent got inside here. That the thing still had dirt or food caked in it, and you were like, by the way, cups get dirt when kids play with cups outside. It's not like dirt from the kitchen table. Anyway, but you'd find it like inside and you'd be like, okay, well, this doesn't, I could put the cup in the cabinet and you could look and be like, oh, that looks fine on the outside, but you can't use that. Or it's the same way in which somebody is suddenly coming over and you're running through the house and you're grabbing stuff and throwing it into the closet or upstairs where guests don't go. You haven't really cleaned, you've just made it acceptable on the outside. And Jesus says, look, the problem is not just you're inconsistent. And I think Jesus is calling out inconsistency. He knows that is the condition of hearts that are striving to be faithful. Jesus is calling out two-facedness. Jesus is calling out a sense where you care about what it looks like on the outside and you're not paying attention to what it looks like on the inside. And he specifically names it in terms of greed and in terms of wickedness. And the greed, I think, is striking because we'll see soon in Luke's gospel that Jesus says, watch out about being greedy. And Jesus calls watch out because he recognizes how it can hide from us. That is not always obvious to us when we're being greedy. And so this is one of those places Jesus is saying, look, this could be happening to you on the inside. So, what is this two-facedness, this Phariseeing it up by focusing on the external at the expense of the internal look like? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. So I was told this story sometime back, actually about a seminary up in the Northeast, and they had this mysterious problem where during the day, they would go through some of the wooded area on campus, and the tops of some of the trees were there on the ground. And there was this concern of like, is there some kind of like disease that is starting to eat away at the forest here on our campus? And then one early morning, there was the security guard was patrolling, and he hears this sound that he's unsure of what it is and goes to investigate and realizes it's the sound of a chainsaw. And so he calls out, and the chainsaw had stopped, and the person comes out, and holding the chainsaw is one of the professors there from the seminary. And this professor had asked the seminary administration if there was a way that from his office window he could have a view out to the coastline and to the ocean, and had been told no. So he was secretly at night taking matters into his own hands and cutting down the tops of trees in order to give himself a view of the ocean. And I just want to add, one of the classes that the seminary professor taught, environmental ethics. Caring about something on the outside without regard for the inside. or a small one closer to home. So I really want my kids to learn naturally to share with each other, to have a heart, a predisposition toward, yes, I am happy to offer what I have to you. And so we see it especially like with food, like, oh, can I have a bite of that? Oh, can I have a drink of that? And I lament that it feels like my kids so often, their first instinct is no. But where do they get it from? They get it from the fact that their dad, when he has a soda and they say, hey, Dad, can I have a sip? Often my first response is no. No, and I can dress it up with, well, like you're a kid, I'm an adult, my life's already like over the hill. It's okay if I drink soda this much. But the actual reality is I'm just actually being greedy. Like I'm sitting there thinking, no, I want all of this that I can. And in a small way, the disposition of my heart is not toward generosity. And I'm asking something of them. I'm living here in one way on the outside, but that's not where my heart actually is. And so maybe you see it. Maybe it's the ability to speak nicely to somebody while on the inside, you have a sense of looking down on them or making fun of them. We're thinking about particularly leaders within the church. I think this is the kind of thing that Jesus is calling out in what is called the prosperity gospel. And it's easy to make it a bogeyman, but there is a reality that I was reading again this week. You read about the stories of people who feel vulnerable, who feel like life is hard and against them, and who find themselves enticed by these offers of, if you send me this amount of seed money, then God will bless you and provide for you. And that is a greed that steals from the vulnerable and exploits them. Or you think about the incident of sexual abuse and exploitation by pastors. And I read afresh this week about somebody like Bill Hybels from Willow Creek. An incredibly successful, thriving ministry, genuinely lots and lots of people whose lives were changed by what happened at Willow Creek. And at the same time, what came to light was a pattern of decades of exploitation of women, including women who worked for him. And that is wickedness that Jesus calls out here. This sense of, if the external is put together, then I don't need to care that much about the internal. And the two-facedness. So what does Jesus say? It's kind of a bit of a puzzling response. Jesus in 41 says, but give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. Almsgiving is the Jewish practice of giving to the poor. And so if Jesus is calling out greed, one of the things he's saying is, we'll give as alms. But that alone isn't necessarily the answer, because it is entirely possible to give, and to give what looks like generously, and to do it in a way that is disconnected from our hearts, to do it as only on the external. So Jesus is saying, I think, something more than just that, because he says it, those things that are within. Jesus is saying it does matter what you do externally, but it also matters what you do internally, and how it is your heart is disposed and where it is aimed. And Jesus is saying you have to have the both and. And it is in particular giving, he says, to those who are in need and who are vulnerable, that can be a means to work on your heart. Because it's those who are in places where they don't have something that they can stand on for themselves, some way in which they are dependent, some ways in which they are vulnerable. And for us to direct our hearts and say, I want to help there. Well, Jesus, I think, is drawing our hearts to say, because I'm in that same place in real ways. Like I too am needy and dependent and vulnerable. So how do you want to pay attention to your heart? Well, I'll give you a test case. If you are prone to say something like, yes, I have some issues, but really that's between God and me. Yeah, I acknowledge there are things in my life that are not good, that are not right, but like, hey, I'm with God, I'm dealing with that. And there's a way that can be true. There's a place and a way in which you don't just share indiscriminately what is hard or what is dark inside your life, but I fear that kind of statement actually is a way of still divorcing the outside from the inside. And by making kind of a head nod to the inside, but not actually really going there, it's a way of saying, look, I want you to look at me and judge me based on what you can see externally, but I'm going to hide away what is on the inside. And I think the antidote to that is to actually be in a place relationally where you can confess to other people what is in the inside. Where you actually can be real about opening up and being honest about the baggage and about the darkness. And yes, about the greed and about the wickedness. Because you accept and believe that what you present on the outside is not what makes you acceptable. It's not what makes you okay. And it takes the transforming safety of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, to lead us to a place like that. So it's one of the ways Jesus says that we are prone to Pharisee it up. Let's look at a second one. We Pharisee it up when we focus on what we can get right. Look at verse 42. Jesus says, "But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." So the Pharisees are serious about tithing, about giving a tenth of everything that they have to the Lord. And the principle is clearly from the Old Testament. Leviticus 27 says, anything that you receive that comes from the land in some way, you are to give a tenth back to God because God's the one who's given you the land. God is the one who has given you all of these things and made it produce. And so you are to give back to God as a recognition of that. And Jesus says, yes. Jesus isn't saying don't do that. Jesus isn't saying, hey, what really matters is just the attitude and the posture of your heart. Jesus is saying it's both and. Jesus is saying, yeah, do that, but don't do it at the neglect of the bigger things. And the question is, well, why this disconnect for them where they are scrupulous about the mints and the herbs and tithing, even like all these little garden growths, but not justice and love of God? And I think it's because the tithe is something that you can measure and you can get right. Like you can have a sense of precision and exactitude and be like, okay, I know exactly what I need to do here and I can do that. I can get that right. Whereas things like justice and love of God, character and heart and virtue, those aren't measurable in nearly the same way. How do you know that you are getting those right? Well, you can't in the same way. And so I think so often our hearts crave the ability to say, I've done that right. And we can end up focusing our efforts there and feeling like if I can say that, then I know that I'm right. And this one for me particularly hits home. I have, as my coach has said, I hope he's slightly exaggerating, but he might be just like telling it like it is. He has said to me, Charles, your personality is almost addicted to being right. Like that sense of I have this, man, I can say I do it the right way. Like here it is, it's precise, it's exact. So, stupid example. Once or twice a week, Aaron and I, in our workouts up at the Y, we go to a class that's called Body Pump. It's 45 minutes, weightlifting, lots of different people. And I have a tendency, I'm like looking in the mirror and I can see people and I'm thinking, you're not doing that right. Like, you're supposed to be squatting, and they specifically say, like, you're supposed to get all the way down, like butt to the knees, and then back up, and you're supposed to stay on the beat. And like, every class has like one of those two people, and they only kind of go down a little bit. Or they're down and like, you're like, no, we're supposed to be right here, not right down here and stuff. And in my heart, I am judging that person for not getting it right. And it's really stupid. And yet that's where my heart goes. This sense of, oh, well, I do it right. Because the companion to that is not just I do it right, but I do it better. That comparison is tied in with this sense of I do things the right way, I do things the righter way than you do. And so you see it like, say you get an email that's inviting you to sign up for a meal train to help somebody. And you look and do you think about, well, I always make sure I sign up to bring a meal, but I'm not sure other people do. Or I sign up to bring more meals than people do. Well, then somebody goes, okay, well, maybe I don't sign up each time, but when I sign up, I don't just do a DoorDash gift card or a meal from Costco. I do things that are homemade. And we're like trying to figure out, how do I get it right in a way that I can define, that I can measure, and I've gotten it right, and I've gotten it a little more right than you have. And that, I think, is a lurking challenge for us as a church. There are ways in which, and there are tensions here, there are ways in which we at Redeemer do some things a little bit differently. And people often will come and be like, I have not experienced communion every week, or kneeling for confession, and a confession that isn't just like religious jargon, but actually is like nailing it where it might actually find my heart and my life, or liturgical art, or being in the city and being serious about being urban. All of these things, look, we mean to do all of those things. All of those things are significant for what we want to be about because we think it's faithful to our city, to our place, and to the gospel. That is not the issue. The issue is when we say and take pride in that, when we have this sense of, oh, we get it right more than that church does, more than those believers do. Our hearts so often want to be able to say, I get it right. And the problem is that we pit, without realizing it, we pit rightness against love. Because when you are so concerned to get things right, it is difficult to love somebody else in their different, not the same rightness that I want kind of way. And there's a self-deception on our parts that we can get things right, and that if we do get things right, that it makes us right. Now, there are lots of other seeds and shoots that Jesus identifies, but I want to focus in here as we move toward a finish. Like if we full on Pharisee it up, what does that end up looking like? Look at verse 44. Jesus says, woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it. And this is a major, major call out by Jesus, because here's the problem. So again, if you have contact with a dead body or even with a grave, you are rendered unclean for 7 days. And so they would typically whitewash every spring. You would whitewash tombs so that when somebody is walking by, they see it and they don't accidentally come into contact with it in order to maintain ritual purity. And Jesus is saying, you are like an unmarked grave. What he means is, if anybody comes into contact with you, if anybody takes seriously your faith and how you say we should relate to God, if anybody follows your way of life, you defile them. It is like you have brought destruction onto them, into their lives, because of the way in which you do things. You want to be clean, you make people unclean. You want to lead the life, you're inviting people to death with this approach. That is how seriously Jesus takes this disconnect of the inside from the outside. This sense of I can get things right in how I relate to God by what I do. But notice, Jesus pronounces these as woes. And we've seen woes in Luke's gospel. They are not words of judgment, they are words of warning of judgment. A woe is a cry actually of compassion and of pain that says, look out, where you are going will destroy you, but you're not there yet. So Jesus issues harsh words here, actually to wake them and us up to the reality so that we would turn from a destructive path. Trying to keep the rules to be okay leads either to self-congratulation or self-condemnation, but both of those are bondage. Neither of those lead to freedom and life. And one of the commentators pointed out something really interesting here. He said, there are 6 woes in this passage, 3 to the Pharisees, 3 to the lawyers. Similarly, he said actually how Isaiah, as a prophet, back in Isaiah 5, called out 6 woes. But the question is, wait a minute, 7, not 6, 7, tends to be the number in the Bible. So where is the 7th woe? And the 7th woe for Isaiah was when he was confronted with the holiness of God in the temple and he cried out, "Woe is me, for I am unclean." And I think Jesus is inviting us in the same way today, naming 6 woes so that as we read them, that we would be led to cry out, "Woe am I, woe is me, I am an unclean person." And to realize that we need Jesus to come to us as Lord. And the new covenant promises that Jesus makes are all about working from the inside out. Our assurance in this season has been entirely in terms of the new covenant promises that Jesus promises to mediate, where he works his life from the inside out for us and gives us a heart and a spirit and a life from the inside. And if we're called here, we're told to seek justice and love. Justice and love are given to us as a gift at the cross, where the justice of God is done and sin in its sinfulness is put to death, and all of the ways in which the law hangs over us as a curse is laid on Jesus, so that the rightness of Jesus is given to us in place of our attempts, out of God's love for us. It is ironic, the Pharisees and the lawyers gather in order to figure out a way ultimately to put Jesus to death, and it is in their sinful reaction to Jesus that they actually fulfill the means of Jesus' gift of grace to us, changing us from the inside out, turning us from trying to make ourselves okay to actually receiving, as those who are spiritually poor, the gift of mercy. So how should you come to the Thanksgiving table this week? First, the application is not, hey, go pick a fight because Jesus picked a fight, okay? That misses the heart. And second, I want to acknowledge it may well be that you feel this tension, like I don't fit in around this table. The way that I see things, the way that I want to live life isn't in harmony with the rest of my family. And that may be the case. Like that may be for real the situation that you find yourself in. It might not just be in your head. And so the invite is, how do I come to the Thanksgiving table as someone who comes first to the communion table? The communion table, where we are acknowledging that we are not right. The precondition for getting to come to this table is acknowledging I don't deserve to come to this table. I don't belong at this table. I receive it as a gift. That I come to this table as one who is confessing all of the ways in which I try to make myself right, that they fall short, and that what I need is mercy. What I need is compassion. What I need is a life that isn't mine, given to me as a gift. To be able to sit secure at the table as a son or a daughter, not by my achievement, but by the gift that God has given to us. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you for your table. And we thank you that this table is the sign and the seal that you have given your life for us, that you became a curse for us. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That all of the law that hung over and against us, that is good and yet is distorted in our hearts, that you have taken and you have kept and fulfilled, and you give now yourself as a gift in our place. So help us come to this table as those who repent, not just from greed and wickedness, but from all of the ways in which we try to achieve a standing on our own. And transform us from the inside out, that what is inside and what is outside would be together in integrity, oriented in grace towards you. And we ask it, Jesus, in your name. Amen.